Good morning. We're here on July the 8th in our one-year Bible study. I've been waiting for July the 8th all week. I'm so excited about this reading. This is just these scriptures that we're reading today has been absolutely life-changing for me. And I'm just going to talk about Acts chapter 26 today. The Old Testament reading in Chronicles, it continues the same. I want to talk about one thing in Chronicles. In Chronicles chapter 5, verse 31. So this is in the middle, as we've talked the last 4 days, how God has laid out for us in writing. He's put it in writing. Who begat who, the begats and the begots in the Bible, who's the son of who, the lineage. Yesterday we talked about the reason he does that is because he's wanting us to get it. He wants us to understand what it means to him that we're his sons and his daughters. Nothing's more important to him than we recognize him as Father, that we understand that he recognizes us as sons and daughters, flesh of his flesh, bones of his bones. He breathed his life into Adam, and these are important scriptures. I don't want to discount them at all. I hope I've done justice to what God put into my heart about these scriptures that are tough to read. It's not easy to read the Chronicles. But it's important that we read the Chronicles. It's important that we understand how important family is to God. But right here in the middle, verse 31 is, these are the men whom David put in charge of the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark rested there. In the middle of the begats and the begots, who's the son of, who's the father of, the family lineage of all these, he makes a point of pointing out various people and what they did, what their roles was. Just prior to that, he talked about who was the priest in the temple that Solomon had built. But I wanted to bring out the one about the songs because so many times in our life, through our journey, we go, well, I don't have any giftings. There's nothing I can do for God. He won't use somebody like me. And that's just lies from beneath. He uses all of us, and he uses the giftings, and he's gifted all of us. And it was so important, those that sing, that he made a special place to talk about them being in charge of the songs for the temple. So all of us can sing. I mean, we can make a joyful noise unto the Lord, but we all have giftings. That's what I wanted to say about that. And then I want to go right to Acts 26. So again, just a little bit of a review. Paul's in prison, has been in prison. That is very well documented in just the scriptures we've read, without going to any historical commentaries, any history books, just the readings we have here. He's already been in prison for at least 2 years. At least 2 years. He's already pled his case before Felix, before Festus, who were higher ups in the king's ranks. And he had them convinced he was innocent. They were convinced, but they wouldn't release him. I mean, and I tell you that because of the frustration that had to tempt Paul. As I was reading it, even again this morning, I can remember back to specific times when somebody was upset because so-and-so said so-and-so, and this person said this, and they knew they were lying. Those words came up in my head. They know they're lying. They know they're lying, and they still, those words come up about, and they know what the truth is. They know what the truth is. And we talked about the fact that things like this creates wars among nations. Things like this completely destroys families. Somebody says something that's not a truth, accuses somebody that's not a truth, and whole families are split up. So here's Paul on the receiving end of lies. And it's one thing to be lied about. It's another thing to be put into prison, into the conditions in which Paul had to endure in this prison over false lies. And then it's just like it just keeps getting piled on top of each other. It's okay, so a lie was told. Paul was beaten. A lie was told about Paul, and Paul gets kicked out of a town. Another lie was told about Paul, and now they're wanting to put him in prison. Another lie gets told, and now they're wanting to kill him. So right now there's a plot here. It's not good enough for him that he's in prison. There's also an ongoing plot to kill Paul. And Paul knows it because his nephew comes to prison and tells him that if they move him, that they're going to ambush him and they're going to kill him. And then it's just like this last layer was Felix and Festus knew he was innocent. They knew he was innocent. And yet they continued to keep him in prison. So he's pled his case to Festus. He's pled his case to Felix. He's still in prison. And okay, Lord, guide me that I say the words that I want to say, because he gets his opportunity then to speak before King Agrippa. So King Agrippa comes to town, and they're going to put him before King Agrippa. And King Agrippa, just for a little bit of background, is a Jew by birth and by raising. And what that means is that King Agrippa is very, very aware of all of the prophecies that said that there would come a Messiah. So you got to know that background in that King Agrippa, unlike Felix and Festus, had in-depth knowledge about prophecy. And remember the background of Paul. And in today's reading, Paul reminds them that he was a Pharisee. He was the worst of the Pharisees. He was the most fervent, is one translation of the Pharisees, that he persecuted the Christians, the ones who believed in Jesus Christ, with the most vigor and enthusiasm of anybody that persecuted them. I mean, he rounded them up, he put them into prison, and then he voted to have them killed. That's all documented in this week's reading and in today's reading. What he does is he gets a chance to talk to King Agrippa. My first point with getting to talk to King Agrippa, though, is I want to remind us of the conditions in which Paul was in prison. For over 2 years, he's in a rock dungeon underneath the city that the sewage, during the rainy season, the sewage ran through. He didn't have a nice, soft, comfy cushion. He didn't have a nice, let's just talk about today's prisons, bunk bed that has a 4-inch hard mattress. A mattress is still a mattress versus what Paul had to sleep on. Paul slept on rocks. And Paul got 1 meal a day, oftentimes bread and water, and it was lowered down through a little manhole that they said that not even every grown man was able to be lowered into. If you were a large-sized man, the historical texts say you couldn't fit through the manhole, the hole that was dug into these rocks that they lowered his food and water in. He went days at a time that he didn't see sunshine except when that manhole was opened up. I mean, you have no idea. We have no idea. I don't think in my wildest imagination I can really get a grasp on the conditions that Paul was in prison. And in this prison, he wrote a good deal of the testimony of the New Testament for us. Where Paul was with God is so much where I want to be with God, and more. And I'm not where I need to be, but praise God, I'm not where I used to be, because again, leading up to today's reading, Acts chapter 26, they had to bring Paul up and they had to shower him to get the filth off of him. I read one account in a historical research I did that said they had to bathe him for 3 days. However, I will tell you that during this week's study, I believe it was just 1 day. But they had to bathe him. They weren't going to bring him in stinking and filthy the way the condition he was in his dungeon, and bring him before the king. So they had to wash him and bathe him. And then one of the texts I read is they put perfume on him to keep him from stinking. And so they bring him in, and in today's version, today's reading, I'm going to read it out of the King James. Yesterday, I asked y'all to read this in the King James Version. There's a reason. In today's reading, Acts chapter 26, this is what it says, verse 1. Then King Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth his hand and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee, touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews. I think myself happy. I think myself happy. In the most deplorable of conditions, not only was he in prison for things he didn't do, not only had he already stated his defense in his case twice and knew he won him over and they still wouldn't take him out of prison, not only was there a plot out to kill him that he knew any place he turned outside of those prison walls could be his certain death. He didn't have a word from God right now whether he would live or die. He didn't know. But we read in yesterday's reading where he said that death wouldn't stop him from doing what he's going to do. I mean, it's just like he taunted him and said, "Oh, you want to do bad things to me? Kill me. Why don't you just kill me?" I mean, my paraphrase, but that's what he was doing because he had no fear of death. He had no fear. He knew, and he knew what waited for him on the other side of death was beyond his wildest imaginations of any glory he was experiencing here. And right in the midst of that dungeon, Paul was experiencing God's glory. I think myself happy. Those words has completely changed my life. I heard them for the first time more than 10 years ago at Cowboy Junction Church in Veneta, Oklahoma. Pastor Wade Markham is the one that gave a sermon on Paul speaking about being happy in the middle of that prison. And I'd read the words before, just like in today's translation. This is one reason I love to use different translations. When I'm needing a word-for-word translation, I'm always going to use the King James Version. But today's version that we use is the English Standard Version, which is supposed to be a near literal translation. Today, in that version, it says, So Agrippa said to Paul, You have permission to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa. So I think myself happy. I consider myself fortunate. Either one of those will wreck you. I mean, I think myself happy. I consider myself fortunate. What's he have to be fortunate about? I mean, where's his luxury? Where's his Mercedes-Benz he's driving? Where's his down comforter he covers up with at night? Where's his massive meals of food, food that gets... He has no of the creature comforts he doesn't even have electricity, let alone air conditioning. And he considers himself fortunate. I mean, this is the status of this man's heart. He is so full of the Spirit of God that he doesn't feel the discomforts of his physical body that's on him because he's so full of God that he considers himself fortunate. Wow, you all, I want to be there. I'm closer to there than I was over 10 years ago the first time I had this preached to me. I'd read the scriptures before many times. Acts is a book I studied a lot when I started learning about the baptism of the Holy Ghost as a teenager. I'd read these scriptures a lot, and it never hit me and impacted me like it did then, and it does every single time I read this. I consider myself fortunate. Now I want to take it a step further today, and I want to be brief with it. But so he tells the king that he thinks himself happy, and he considers himself fortunate. Now, in the context of Acts 26, I've used it for the status of my life. if things are going wrong in my life, my business isn't going like I think it should, the relationship with my kids aren't where I think it should, the health of my mother and father-in-law isn't where I think it should be, or I'm worried about my mom's health, or I'm worried about my health, or I'm worried about Tom, or whatever it is in our life. I'm worried about the economy. I'm worried about the elections. These are all things going on in America today. These are all things that tend to steal our joy. My husband and I are fighting. My kids and I are fighting. My neighbor is taking me to court. I've had a bad accident. On and on and on and on. Whatever state we find ourselves in now, none of it compares to the state in which Paul was in when he said the words, "I think myself happy." We have the ability to maintain calm and peace and true joy, the joy of the Lord in our hearts, regardless of the circumstances around us. But I want to take it a step further. Once again, it's getting down to the bare bones in what's going to happen to Paul. He's already been in prison for over 2 years. He's finally before the king, and he has his opportunity to state his case. And if you read today's scriptures, Paul really didn't even state his case. What he did is he appealed to a fellow Jew. He appealed to a fellow Jew, not for his release, but for the Jew, King Agrippa's salvation. At one point in here, he tells King Agrippa, he looks at him right in the eye. I can just see Paul doing it. And he's been given his testimony on his experience with Jesus Christ on the road of Damascus. A resurrection from the dead. Jesus Christ was resurrected. He reminds Agrippa that he knows of it, that King Agrippa was alive and he heard the real life accounts of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Nobody can discount. There was enough eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ that they don't even dispute that he was resurrected. What puts him different than anybody else resurrected from the dead is he's the only one resurrected that didn't die again. Anybody else that's been brought back from the dead died a physical death later, not Jesus. King Agrippa knew this was a documented case. He lived through the time. Paul knew this about him, and Paul knew that he had the training of a Jew, and he knew the writings of the prophecies of Jesus's coming, and he appealed to his heart. He wasn't making an appeal for his release. He was making an appeal to have one man saved. One man saved at his own risk of death, at his own risk of continued imprisonment. He looked him in the eye and he said, "King Agrippa, I know that you know these things." He knew there was belief there. He could see it with his spiritual eyes that there was belief in King Agrippa's heart to the words that he was speaking. And it was all worth it if the only person hearing his voice that believed it and received the salvation that Jesus Christ gave to him was just one person. It was worth it for Paul. Wow. Wow. Would I, in such a case, lay down my right to be innocent, lay down my right to be freed from prison, lay down my right for a warm bed, a warm shower, to be clean for the sake of the salvation of just one? Take care of the one. God will put the one in front of you that needs to hear your story. Paul just shared his story. That's what he did. He just shared his story. There wasn't a sense of urgency in him that he had to convince him, because Paul if you read it. Paul kept himself back from the sense of urgency of that, oh my gosh, I got to get this one saved. There was none of that. It was simply, King Agrippa, I know you believe. This is what happened to me, and I know you believed. And then he backed off and left the rest up to God inside of King Agrippa's heart. Wow. Wow. Every one of us will have the one in front of us. And it may be the one that's accused us. It may be the one that spit on us. It may be the one that's attacked our children. It may be the one that's attacked our character. It may be the one that's stolen from us. It may be the one that's raped us. It may be the one that's murdered our children. We'll have the one in front of us. We'll have that one in front of us. What will we do? We got to see what Paul did. I love you. I thank y'all for joining me, and we'll chat next week.